Greetings everyone and welcome to BrickCats. Today I am reviewing UsernameGeri's T-47 Snowspeeder. Liking this review, subscribing to my channel, or leaving a comment are all great ways to support what I do, and I thank you very much in advance. The T-47 needs little introduction as the Alliance's main fighter in the Battle of Hoth, but we also saw some T-47s recently in the Kenobi series on the moon Nur. Without any substitutions for this model, I was getting 3 stores and $70 before shipping and tax, or about $88 including shipping and tax. Instructions are available for $6 on Rebrickable. In my reviews, I offer my opinions on aesthetics and model features, parts issues you might want to look out for, the build experience, the model's integrity, and last but not least, I offer my closing thoughts. If you're watching this review, I assume that you have bought the instructions or are interested in buying them. I also assume a basic level of familiarity with Bricklink's ordering system and LEGO nomenclature. My disclaimer on this and all my mock reviews is that I only use genuine LEGO bricks, and I always purchase the instructions. Lastly, I create these reviews for my own personal enjoyment, and in the hopes that my advice will make your experience more enjoyable and or less expensive. UsernameGeri's T-47 measures 8 inches long, 7 inches wide, and sits 5.5 inches tall on the stand. And if you take it off the stand and set it flat on the surface, the table, it's about 1.5 inches tall. And that's 20.3 by 17.8 by 14 centimeters on the stand and 3.8 centimeters off the stand. Starting right at the front, this is what I think is the most complicated shape of the speeder to get right and to recreate in LEGO, and that is the wedges right in front of the cockpit here. The designer uses 4x4 corner wedges set with toe ball connections, and another wedge piece on a hinge brick here with a plate over the top. I do like this implementation for its sturdiness, and I think that alone is worth the studs. These aren't moving around very much, and it's very hard to get them to pop off or anything like that. And I can also see how some people might take issue with this, as this is really only the only significant studded area on this model. The cockpit hinges in a film-accurate location, and it seats 2 minifigures comfortably. Inside, you can see there's an array of printed tiles and slopes. I substituted some of the printed tiles I had on hand. Personally, I think the old Spurious tile and the Tron panel here fit pretty well into the Star Wars color scheme. The pilot and the gunner sit snugly in their seats, and there are studs at the bottom to hold them in, so they're not just floating there. And one kind of quirky thing I noticed is that the pilot's arms actually have to be quite low in the cockpit, otherwise this doesn't close all the way. If you have the arms too high, you'll see just the slightest gap right at the front windscreen here. And this means that the tap pieces representing the pilot's controls need to be turned in pretty significantly to give the hands enough room to go down all the way there. This wasn't a huge deal, but it honestly kind of drove me nuts trying to figure out why this gap was there. I thought it was the helmets initially, but when I took off the helmets, it was still there, so that wasn't it. So just be mindful of that. The arms need to be put all the way down, kind of flush with the slope panels there. The wings are wedges with plates and tiles on top, and I really like how this looks. I don't mind the occasional stud here, especially along the edges of the wedge pieces. And you could tile these over if you really wanted to. I also think that the cannon assemblies look very good, with some nice parts usage to create the various textures and the shape along the length. And UsernameGeri has included this dark bluish gray section to represent the interior section of what the Star Wars visual guide calls the repulsor units. This model does have working topside and underside flaps, so they lift up like this, and they're just on kind of a double hinged Technic construction on top. And underneath, the flaps come down like this. This is just another Technic connection, and there is some representation of like hydraulics here, which is a nice addition. using the tan 3L pin with friction ridges, or without friction ridges rather, you can barely see it right here. This does mean that this is a little loose. You could try it with the blue one that has the friction ridges, the blue 3L Technic pin, and that means that it would be slightly more difficult to get open. Personally, I think this is okay, as if you have too much resistance lifting it up here, then the tile tends to come off, and that's kind of annoying. And honestly, these aren't going to be up that much, I don't think, unless you're trying to pose it, but it does stick in this position pretty well. The harpoon gun is included where you'd expect, but like most other Snowspeeder LEGO models, it is much too large to be in scale with the rest of the speeder. The newer 2L bar with stop ring would work better here instead of the 3L and 4L bars. And there is an alternative option included in the instructions that uses the old camera piece, if you're interested in that or already have one to use. And that one is slightly more in scale, but still quite large for what I think it should be. The actual tow cable is not included, and I am totally okay with that. There is a representation of the magnetic head here, and as a side note, this kind of made me wonder how the harpoon and tow cable actually works. So apparently you fire something from this little gun here, and then the cable gets spooled out of this little section. I don't know why the head wouldn't be fired out of the gun, and then, I don't know. It's kind of strange, but I guess that's Star Wars. The underside of the ship is mostly anti-studs, and it's essentially flat on the bottom right here. And this isn't canon accurate, but the designer did make an attempt to mask the shape. You can kind of see, like, there's a lot of, not a lot, but there's some parts of the ship in shadow here, and so you kind of get the idea of the front profile there, and you just kind of have to use your imagination a little bit. And the last part of the ship is the rear exhaust fins, and these look really good to me as well. My favorite small detail on this model were these two little wedge assemblies right here and here. And I never actually paid attention enough to this area of the Snowspeeder, either in the movies or in other LEGO models, to appreciate that this was there. But it does kind of make sense because it kind of continues the wing shape like this. So props to the designer for including that little part. Finally, I really love this stand as it looks good by itself and doesn't draw attention away from the model when the model is mounted on top. And it has this pretty simple but effective tilt mechanism, so you can tilt it from side to side. And you can lock it in place with this Technic axle, which I have stored here. And all you do is you take out this plate. You can see that there are 3 Technic lift arms there, and when you tilt it from side to side, you can kind of see it moving there. And if you have it perfectly level, this Technic pin slides in like that, and then you cover it back up with the tile. And then, of course, obviously you just pop the Technic pin out, and you can tilt it, and then this just, you can stuff it there, or use it somewhere else, whatever. I think it looks best in the tilt orientation, and while it's meant to be a side-to-side kind of deal, this is just a 4x4 modified tile, so you could change the orientation if you wanted to, and I guess you could have it tilted forward, if I can get this. This square just rests in that hole there. So you could have it tilt forward like this if you wanted to, or back, I guess, but really meant to be side to side, and that's how I think it looks best. Oh. So there you go. So overall, I think this is a very good looking model. It has a great amount of detail and some nice play features that speak to its display value. I do think the overall proportions are a little off. For example, I think it's a bit too wide to be strictly canon accurate, but given the limits of the LEGO wedge inventory, I'm not sure that's a problem that can or really needs to be fixed. And for comparison purposes, here it is next to Brickvault's model. So a little difficult to see because of the camera angle, but you can kind of see that this UsernameGeri is significantly larger than Brickvault's. This model requires 617 pieces and 202 elements. To order parts for this model, the designer has included a number of different parts lists for each main section. 2 for the main body, from which you select white or light bluish gray. 2 for the heatsink, from which you choose black or dark bluish gray. And 3 for the color markings, and you get your choice of the red stripes, the orange stripes, which obviously I've opted for here, or the rogue lever dark bluish gray markings. And then the parts list for the stand is also separate. The intent behind keeping all of these parts lists separate is so you can pick and choose which version of the Snowspeeder you want to build, and this allows you to mix and match the various color combinations. I definitely see the merit in this approach, but I think it presents some difficulties, especially for new builders. For example, it's not intuitive to order from multiple wanted lists at the same time on Bricklink, so there might be some unnecessary added costs if a builder orders each wanted list individually instead of doing all 4 at once and perhaps economizing a little bit on shipping. Adding parts from an existing inventory, like if you've got a big spares bin, is also pretty inconvenient because you have to sort through, you have to open up 4 different wanted lists, and instead of scrolling through 1, you'll be scrolling through 4 essentially. And lastly, Bricklink doesn't handle combining wanted lists together very well, because if the same element is listed in both, same element meaning same part number and same color, it doesn't combine them, but it just gives you an error, and you have to adjust it manually. And this is a challenge even for me, and personally I find it really annoying that Bricklink isn't smart enough to just combine them. So I can't imagine anyone unfamiliar with Bricklink doing this very comfortably. So personally, I would have preferred one unified parts list for at least the fighter, and maybe the stand separate. The parts list for the orange and red markings seem less necessary to me, as there aren't any other red or orange markings, red or orange pieces in the build, rather. So the designer could include an orange marking, white body, gray heat sink unified parts list, and include a note that tells the builder that all they need to do to convert this to a red model is to replace all the orange parts with red, for example. At the end of the day, this is mostly personal preference, and I do appreciate the level of customization these separate parts lists offer a builder. One other kind of quirk with the parts list, if you do decide to do all 4 of them separately, you definitely should change the condition for all of the pieces to any. When you first upload the parts list, they all default to new, which is kind of unfortunate, and I'm hoping the designer fixes or changes the XML file to have it be any condition by default. Some part-specific issues I noticed. First, the parts list calls for a 20 plate modified 1x3 with 2 studs, double jumper, part 34103 in white. Only 12 of these are visible. 5 are visible underneath the middle part of the cannon here. It's a bit hard to see on the camera, but it's a lot more noticeable in person. And the other 2 are visible to either side of this cannon section here. So I did put one in light bluish gray just so you could see the edge and kind of make my point here, and the other one's here. So 6 on each side. These can be pretty much any neutral color, I think, as it's pretty hard to see the ones under the cannons, like I mentioned. And the 2 that are visible, I think these would be okay in like light bluish gray, like I have here. Tan, I probably wouldn't go black just because that would be a little more visible, but any neutral color that makes sense would work. The other 8 are located throughout the build and are completely hidden, so those can be any color. The lone hinge plate 2x2 top plate in white, part 6134, is not used as far as I can tell, and I believe this is likely a holdover from a previous version of the build. And I can't remember, UsernameGeri was actually really communicative with me, and I really appreciate that, and I did mention this, so this might have been taken out of the parts list already. One of the hinge brick 1x2 base, part 3937, and one of the hinge brick 2x2 top, hinge plate 2x2 top, part 6134 in light bluish gray are used to connect this front section here, and this is almost completely hidden. In my opinion, this could probably be any neutral color. You can barely see the light bluish gray in between this tile and the windscreen here. There are 2 plate modified 1x1 with U-clip thick, part 4085C, specified in dark bluish gray. This is frequently coming up as very expensive, like $1.50 each in my Bricklink results. but there's no reason this needs to be a U-clip. So the more common plate modified 1x1 with open O-clip, part 4085D in dark bluish gray, will be much less expensive and much more common. And these hold the tap pieces that represent the pilot controls. 2 of the 3 tile 1x2 with groove with vehicle control pattern, part 3069 BPC1, are supposed to go under the flaps right here. It's hard to see these even with the flaps open, and I substituted a 1x2 grill tile instead, part 2412B. You could also probably omit these entirely if you wanted to. The 2 Technic-Gear 20-tooth bevel, part 32198 in light bluish gray, are used in the rear section of the cannons. This piece is fairly expensive, and they're usually over $1 on Bricklink, and they're also not very common for some reason. You could try light gray, the part also comes in light gray, but that's also not very common, so I recommend substituting part 87407, the Technic-Gear 20-tooth bevel with pinhole in light bluish gray. I'll take this off so you can see how it works here. This is a very inexpensive element, and the pinhole section fits perfectly inside the wheel well with the axle there. So structurally, it's pretty much exactly the same. Alternatively, if you wanted the specified gear piece, the actual one specified, they are available from Lego Pick-a-Brick, and it's a standard piece, I believe, and it's about 54 cents in, what is it now? Almost mid-October. Gosh, time flies. The Slope 45 2x2 with controls, buttons, and navigation display pattern. This is the pilot control panel. This tends to be quite expensive, and usually it was coming up at about $1.75, $2, and it's also comparatively rare, so it was definitely adding a store to my Bricklink results. I would probably just replace this. Oh, sorry, this is part 3039 PB108. And I would probably just replace this with a plain black slope, part 3039. In my opinion, the printed slope is not worth that much, plus you're going to pay extra for shipping as well. Lastly, the 2 minifigure neck bracket thin back wall, part 42446 in light bluish gray, hold these little wedge pieces on the back here. The newer version of this piece with the thick back wall, part 28974, might be less expensive, although it really depends on pretty much the day that you're ordering these. I've seen the thick back wall version go for very cheap, but I've also seen the thin back wall version go for very cheap. It just depends on availability and if you've excluded any stores from your Bricklink search results. So my advice there is just to check your algorithm results and make sure you aren't paying a crazy price. Like, I've also seen the thin back wall version go for like $2 each, which is absolutely insane. And then the thick back wall version, for some reason, even though it's newer and in production, seems to have a limited inventory from time to time. The instructions have 139 steps, and that includes the stand. Each piece or subassembly you add in a given step is highlighted with a blue outline, and this works a lot better than I thought it would when I first started building the model. The instructions are really good, they're easy to follow, and the designer has included some helpful notes in the slightly more difficult sections to help the builder out. I didn't run into any viewing angle or instruction perspective problems, and I didn't run into any other problems with the sequence of the build, and all told I think this took me about 2 hours going at a fairly normal pace. As a side note, I'd definitely be interested to know what program the designer used or how UsernameGeri touched them up, because the renders are very sharp, and overall the instructions just look really professional. You can definitely tell that he put in a ton of effort into these, and this is a great example of instructions done right, in my opinion. The model is very sturdy, with only a few real fragile areas, and those would be the harpoon gun, because it's a binocular piece mounted on inside a clip, rather. And then you saw a little earlier, I think, the cockpit can come off sometimes just because these are hollow studs on this windscreen here, and it just tends to pop off. but neither of those are too bad, and there are pretty solid areas to grip the Snowspeeder, like right here, not the flap, but right inside the flap is really good, and the back fins are pretty solidly in place as well. So this will stand up to any amount of swooshing you could reasonably throw at it. And also a nice thing about this model is that when you pick it up, you can definitely feel that it's solid. Some models you pick them up and you can definitely feel things starting to flex or something like that. But this one definitely feels like there's just a lot of plastic in between here and here, which is really great. This stood up to my 5-year-old kind of handling it, and if anyone has 5-year-olds, that you know that Lego is not something that tends to stay together in their hands, but this one did pretty well. The model sits on the stand again with just the right amount of clutch. Like I think I mentioned earlier, that the square tile goes right inside here, and the 2 solid studs offer good amount of resistance, so when it's on the stand, you can bump this a little bit and it's not going to come off. And the stand's base is wide enough so that it's not going to, it can't really tip over or anything unless you really try to. UsernameGeri's T-47 is a very good looking model that's easy to build and very sturdy. The parts list do take some massaging to get the best value from Bricklink, but once built, I don't think anyone's going to be unhappy with this. Like I said, the designer was very responsive to some initial concerns I had with the instructions, so it wouldn't surprise me if they watch. Well, I hope they watch this video, and it wouldn't surprise me if they made some of the changes I've suggested. I think the most important one, really, even if they don't combine the parts list, is to change the default part condition to any instead of new. So without any substitutions, I was getting 3 stores and $70 before shipping and tax, which comes out to about $88 including shipping and tax for both the ship and the stand. Substituting those Technic gears for the cheaper alternative, eliminating the unnecessary hinge plate and the space minigun, which I didn't need because I went with the standard harpoon construction, swapping the 2x2 printed slope for a plain one, using the more common clip pieces for the pilot controls, and changing those 2 printed tiles that are supposed to go underneath the flaps. This brought me down to 2 stores and $63 before shipping and tax, or about $75 including shipping and tax. Finally, I did try to price this out without any of the printed slopes or printed tiles, but that didn't save much. It was only about $3. So in my opinion, you might as well get the slopes and have a fully built out cockpit, because I think it does look really good. And instructions for this model cost a very reasonable $6 US, and there will be a link to the rebrickable page in the description. So thanks as always for watching my review of UsernameGeri's T-47 Snowspeeder. If you've built the model, you have something to share that I left out, or have a question about something I didn't cover, please leave them in the comments. Remember to leave the video a like, subscribe to the channel, or follow me on Instagram if you haven't already, and I hope to see you back next time.